I like to start with prayer. May God be with you. Let us pray. Direct us, O Lord, with your most gracious favor, and further us with your continual help, that in all our work, begun, continued, and ended in you, we might glorify your holy name, and finally, by your mercy, obtain everlasting life. Amen. Well, as my fellow, I know I can't say I'm a Vermonter. We've been there for a couple of years. People there, you've got to be there for 8, 9 generations, I think. But I do greet you from the Diocese of Vermont, the Right Reverend Shannon Brown, the 11th Bishop of the Diocese of Vermont, the second woman and first African American to be bishop there. Our 42 congregations and about 5,000 members. We are, as the only president to have been born in Vermont, Calvin Coolidge would say, about the state of Vermont, a brave little state. We are a feisty little diocese. I want to talk to you today, and I hope the stretch period is enough not to, so you can stay awake for this. I've been known to put people to sleep. But when Titus asked me to talk about this subject, what came to mind was these words that have come up so often about our life in Christ, our life in the church as a community, our life liturgically, memory and hope. And that idea that I'll keep coming back to, mostly about memory and the need to remember. And even in the Eucharist today, when the bishop did the fraction, it is a breaking, but what really is going on, a remembering, remembering of the members actually coming back together. We, though are broken, are one body, for we all share in the one bread and the one cup. And that ultimately, even in the memories that are traumatic and painful, that because of this hope we have in Christ, we have hope for the future. So, and you can thank you. You can't necessarily see the pictures, but I just want to just give a note on my sources today in preparing this talk. The Reverend Dr. Willie Jennings, who is a professor of theology, systematic theology, and Africana studies at Yale Divinity School. And it was his book, Christian Imagination, which he wrote about 11 or 12 years ago. It was the winner of the 2015 Grawemeyer Prize for Religion, which is a very big deal, certainly in the United States. I believe our friends from the UK, Dr. Jennings is coming over to give the Bamford lectures over there. I'll talk a little bit about later, but this book, Christian Imagination, is about really theology and the origins of race. And this is really this point that we may think about race, which is at some level, since we all share about 99.7% of the DNA, people talk about how, well, it's a social construct, but it has even that small finite amount that is different. We can have a lot of ramifications in areas of healthcare, has been referenced a bit in this conference and elsewhere, but also in the way politically, socially, and culturally, those differences. But that, in fact, theology, church people, Roman Catholic and Protestant, particularly in the colonial enterprise of the age of discovery, were deeply embedded in the creation of this. It was not the other way around, of where the church may have been co-opted. Some places it was co-opted, but in the origins of it, Jennings talks about it. He's a systematic theologian, not a church historian per se, but he does great work in this area. The next source was Isabel Wilkerson, who is a former journalist and now twice in a row a Pulitzer Prize winning author of these monumental books The first one was called The Warmth of Other Suns. And the second one is just out only about 3 years ago, called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. And she's talking about that in America's context. And I know we have some friends from the Indian subcontinent, South Asia. In fact, I learned from her, in the subcontinent, the word caste is not used. It is either a Hindu word or an indigenous word that I won't mangle and mispronounce, but that in fact it was the English that put that term caste on. But in the American context, which is what I will mostly talk about today, what we actually have is a caste system. We don't want to admit that, but there are a lot of things we don't want to admit. The third row of my sources are two friends, one American, one a South African, but both have done great work on Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The South African fellow is John Allen, a fellow in the tie. And John was a South African journalist who ended up working as press officer for Archbishop Desmond Tutu when he was the Archbishop of first Johannesburg, Bishop of Johannesburg and then Archbishop of Cape Town. And he is the author of the authorized biography of the Arch called Rabble Rousers for Peace. And the Reverend Dr. Michael Battle, who's my co-editor, along with the Reverend Canon Chuck Robertson on the Anglican Theological Review issue. Michael, who had a 2 decades long relationship with Archbishop Desmond, beginning when he was a student at Duke University, getting his PhD, and wanting to write his dissertation on Desmond Tutu, and lived at Bishop's Court for a few years. And this is about certain parts of it. But what Marsh did was show, in fact, Bonhoeffer from the beginning, and this is sort of the sad thing, I was even taught, well, I'm sure the German church who co-opted themselves, they were co-opted by Hitler and the Nazis. They must have felt a lot of pressure, I'm sure there was. But what Bonhoeffer saw and what Marsh and others have uncovered, the German church willingly, very quickly, the majority joined the nationalist socialist regime. It didn't take much time, and it really didn't take much pressure. And to me, in reading this book, because I think on some level what in America and what happened in South Africa, in dealing with the trauma of the past, in some ways, believe it or not, I think Germany. I'm going to Montgomery next week, for example. Taking group, Phyllis is going to be with a group from Vermont, about 12 of us plus Phyllis. And I encourage you all, if you really want to know about grace, you have to go down to Montgomery, Selma. And there in Montgomery are 2 museums, really a museum and a memorial, both hosted and owned by the Equal Justice Initiative. Brian Stevenson, a lawyer, famous lawyer, MacArthur Genius Award winner, film made on his life, starring famous actor Michael B. Jordan. But what Brian Stevenson noted that in his work, which is really defending people who are marginalized, particularly African Americans, others of color, either sometimes for crimes they didn't commit or even crimes they may have committed, but are unfairly prosecuted and extremely sentenced, including to death. Brian noted that at the root, the origins of this issue are America's legacy from slavery and Jim Crow, all the way up to mass incarceration. There's a connection, and that we've never dealt with the past. And so he was able to raise money for the Legacy Museum, which begins with the arrival of the first Africans and goes up to this century of this era of what we call mass incarceration, and how these are connected. It's incredibly moving. You need to spend a whole day there to really get it. Our bishops, House of Bishops, were there for 2 hours, and my bishop said it just wasn't enough, but even those 2 hours were deeply wrenching. The EJI also has in another location, they're both with downtown Montgomery, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is an interesting name, but is euphemistically or alternatively called the Lynching Memorial, where these incredible, and I couldn't bring those pictures, slabs, which look kind of like headstones, but they hang from ceilings and they hang in this very artistic way. And what it does is every county in America, it will list for each county the names of those who can identify. If they're not identified, they'd be an unidentified person who was lynched. It's quite staggering. When I was there last year in August, there were so many. Of course, I couldn't. I just said I want to go to 3 counties in Mississippi, which is where all my family is from. I'm a proud Buckeye, but I really was raised in Mississippi. And I will fight anybody that says I'm not a Southerner. I am what we call, I'll talk later, but I wanted to go to those 3 counties because I just want to know how many people were lynched there, and it could have been my father, my uncles, and other people. So Brian Stevenson's idea for these came from a visit to Germany and a visit to South Africa, where those nations have chosen, as we say liturgically, the Greek word anamnesis, to remember, to regain something, as opposed to the American habit of what I call amnesia. So, if you can go to the next, thank you. So, this talk is going to be in 4 parts. This is sort of the introduction, some context, and then I'm going to go second part, past. Third part, our present. Fourth part, our future. Or as I say, how then shall we live, as they say in Ezekiel. And that will be interlacing with the story, narrative, that I think illustrates what I'm really talking about, because I am a preacher and mostly a storyteller. The only other context I just want to say that I wanted to be specific, knowing this would be an international or global audience, that text and presentation. The first text is the speaker. And for my context, I am not a British subject or a person who was born or raised in Africa or the Caribbean or Central or Latin America. While I lived in Hawaii for several years as dean of the cathedral, and Hawaii was an American colony, I have not lived in time in a place that is a colony or was a colony of the British, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, or the Portuguese empires. So I need to be careful about I'm not going to suggest any specific solutions beyond my area of context, other than as a minister of the gospel, and from my point theologically, that what we struggle with is really, as Desmond Tutu would say, or Michael Battle, it is actually about an examination of conscience and about repentance, repair. As I think Father Paul had the phrase during our training, it's this whole idea about God made, humans marred, and we are called to mend. And I think that there's in our sacrament, particularly the sacrament of reconciliation, an important thing to remember. So what is my context? Well, as Paul said to the church of Corinth, by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace towards me has not been in vain. I am a 66-year-old African-American. Next slide, thank you. Now, I'm bold, I don't know if you can see. That picture there with the afro that was out here was 15 years ago. I was 16, and I thought I knew everything. And you really can't see, I was hitting overhead smash. I was actually a rather accomplished champion tennis player I was in the high school team. I actually was better in college because I was a late starter. But that was taken, those pictures at St. John's Jesuit High School in Toledo. And when I say that age, it situates me into the next slide you see. I'm the son of another Walter, the gentleman in that uniform in the upper left. It's a World War II veteran. He died in 2018 at the age of 97. His wife, my mother, predeceased him by 16 years. Couldn't find a picture of her. My father, who was all crying, was saying that we lived in the greatest country in the world, which I know other countries would dispute that, but that's basically the way Americans are taught. But the irony is, here's the line that I always remember. His generation is a World War II veteran. His brother, who was a Marine, I'm a Marine veteran. So when I talk about America, I actually paid my dues, so I think I can say these things. The point is that America, these men loved and served their country, but their country did not love them back. My father was almost 90, and he broke down into tears because it was at a VA place where we took him. He was living with us many of those last years. It was only then in his 90s that a white person thanked him for his service in World War II. So when I say his country did not love him back, and his generation, which by the way, at least when white folks talk about that generation, they call it the greatest generation. That's very real because they fought fascism abroad, but they returned to terror and fascism. And I say this in this context is the lower left, The Warmth of Other Suns, this is Bill Wilkerson's book, that, you know, international law defines internally displaced persons as people, right, who have to leave somewhere else where they're living, stay in their own country. So they're technically not considered refugees, but they're called internally displaced, but the experience is like being a refugee. Well, I am a descendant of those 6 million people who were internally displaced. Only when I go back south, you hear the lilt of Mississippi in me when I'm around my cousins and so on, when my grandparents were around. But my father, literally, when he came home from the war, his mother saw that my father had been changed. He would no longer be subservient. He would look white people in the eye. He would not defer to them if they tried to run him off the road. And she said, son, you have to leave or you will die. That is internally. So the Great Migration, which up until the 1990s of this century, was the greatest mass movement of people, 6 million African Americans who fled not just poverty, but terror. That they could be lynched, murdered, raped. My grandmother, my mother's mother, lived with us her last 3 years in Ohio. Those days growing up, they were still door-to-door salesmen. I never understood until I later read the history about why my grandmother was quite light-skinned. Her mother was a product of a rape between a white slave owner and an enslaved woman. But I never understood at that time why she was deathly afraid around white men. It's talking about those generational traumas. So I am raised in that context. And then in the lower right, that was what my wife and I, it's kind of dark, but that was called the Guest Who's Coming to Dinner meeting when I was a young Marine officer and a school teacher in San Diego. We met at a Roman Catholic Jesuit church. I thought I was going to be a Jesuit, but she turned me another direction. That picture was taken at my late in-laws home in Raleigh, North Carolina. Even then, in 1981, my father advised me, wear your uniform when driving from Washington, D.C. down to Raleigh, North Carolina. We have 2 beautiful sons. That picture of me is in front of St. Andrew's Cathedral in Honolulu, where Tina and I, our 2 sons, who tower over us. Martin and Alec, Alexander is in the saint we honor September 10th in the United States Episcopal Church. Alexander Crummell Thurgood was his middle name after the great lawyer Thurgood Marshall. His dad was a young lawyer when they came up with that. And Martin came along 5 years later, his name Martin Desmond. So we know where he gets those from. And I say that I sit between that greatest generation of these millennials, where once they got to college, they of course knew everything. And it was questions like, Dad, why are we here? This country was not built for us. Why do we need to be there? They had already lived in South Africa when they were young and little. They would ask their grandfather those questions. And if you've noticed what's happened in the backlash of people, I swear, I decided I would not name his name, but you know, the governor in Tallahassee and other politicians who are having this backlash against so-called loafers. Just a little clue, no millennial, the word actually started way before in the 50s, and Martin Luther King preached a sermon. His last Sunday sermon, National Cathedral, was called Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. I'll take King over any politician. But when the fact of it is, when people start saying wokeness and they want to attack it, they're like 10 years out of style. My sons wouldn't use that term. But this is how we are pitted against each other. And it really is about not wanting to deal with the history, just my own family history. That would be forbidden in a lot of places, schools and libraries. And my sons, though, like a lot of kids, they think their parents were sellouts, but they know that I was somewhat of an activist, but they are really curious to know how. How did this situation, you're here, and they actually understood it better when we lived in South Africa. They said, okay, yeah, this is good, Dad. And then we go back because they wanted to be American teenagers. But as they got older, they're 78, 79. I was in Quantico, Virginia, in the Marine Corps that time. But my sort of cohort, we believed, because we were the first generation of so-called affirmative action babies, that we were going to do great things, and that nothing would stop us. I've been married to Tina for 41 years. And as I say that my parents were both able to meet their grandchildren, it was in some ways a validation of their lives and of their hope that somehow their sons both getting advanced degrees, both of us, my brother and I, first generation college, and yet the reality of America, some ways are still, the dream is still not completely realized. And so, to me, the scripture tells us that part of the struggle was what Paul talked about in the church in Ephesians, that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against the powers, the rulers of darkness of this world, against the spiritual wickedness in high places. And the problem of race and the issue and colonialism deeply intertwined with this is that we are inheritors of a house. But this house at their foundation, or sometimes we talk about houses, the bones of a house. The house is great bones. Even if it's old, we can do something. The bones of our houses have a defect. The defect at its core. And I share that because looking by a house like that doesn't mean a lot of blame or shame someone. But we have to do something about the house. When I look at it, acknowledge the past, I remember this context of the first priest from South Africa. I met Desmond Tutu in the 1980s when I worked on Capitol Hill, but the first priest that was a very quick meeting at that time, but one of his former chaplains, a woman named Wilma Jacobson, who had come to America, not only had she studied at Fuller Seminary in the 80s, but then she came back and did a year at Union Theological. And while I was a lawyer and discerning about, I had become an Episcopalian really in the 80s, and that has a lot to do with Desmond Tutu, but for time's sake, when I was in 1996 a lawyer, I was working for the mayor of Cleveland, but I had to come into DC for a meeting of the American Bar Association. And while I was there, a friend, I'll just say a prominent priest in the church of a major congregation, had invited Wilma to spend the weekend visiting and talking at their church. And this priest invited me to, come and actually stay at their house. And Wilma was there and spent Sunday. But the night before, on the Saturday evening, there was a dinner party at this deanery. And there, this African-American woman professor was not exactly thrilled even of meeting a South African, a white woman, but someone had been chaplain to Desmond Tutu. And I think she taught Africana studies or something, but I asked her what was the issue, and she said, well, the problem is from colonialism, that Africans already had their own worldview, and this thing we call Western Christian was imposed on them. And then my response was, I thought I was sophisticated enough, I could say, but Christianity has been for 2 millennia in Africa, the Ethiopian church, for example, in Egypt and elsewhere. And she, yeah, well, that's one part, but the point is that in South Africa, the Bantu people had their own worldview. And I didn't want to get into a long, involved argument, and as I've reflected over the years, and my time in South Africa actually has given me a sense of peace and healing in reply to this woman. What I think her comments reflect is, of course, the pain of this legacy of racism and colonialism. When I talk about America, I'm referring often to South Africa, because for African Americans, we were glad when Algeria was free and when Nigeria was free, and Kenya, Tanzania, when all these African colonies became independent from their European power. But it is in South Africa because it not only was a subject of colonialism, but apartheid was something that we can relate to for those who experienced Jim Crow segregation. And the similarities there were certainly borne out to us. And in that context, it is, in the next slide, is this American reluctance. I was at a wedding of one of my nieces, one of my white nieces. Actually, my wife, she doesn't like me to say that she's white. See, her father was actually an Arab, Lebanese. The mother was very Irish, she was Scotian German. But anyway, one of her brothers, we were at a wedding, and we were sitting at the table with 2 friends of theirs. They're American citizens now, but they're British. They're one from the north, one from London. And I just remember talking to them about history, which I love to talk about. And the fellow said, I don't talk to my family about that. I just think you should just look forward. Don't look past, don't look backwards. And that, it was a wedding, so I was gonna be polite, but amnesia is this idea of let's look forward, we don't have to worry about it. But my experience, and those of you who are clergy, the problems that people have pastorally are the fact that they've not examined their lives, their past, as well as their present. It's denial. There's a great book, another source I could mention was a book called How to Hide an Empire. It's a great book about American colonialism. Daniel, I'm just mispronounced his name, Awarmer, but this book gets to this point about the empire of America, all these places from Cuba and in the Pacific Ocean, Hawaii, they're all over. But as the Episcopalian and journalist Ray Suarez said, America was as an empire, but we've never copped to it, never admitted it. So there we are. And coming out of that, as I said, wrestling with these powers and principalities, the gentleman on your left, the criticism of what they call critical race theory, Derek Bell, the first African-American teacher at Harvard Law School, was the one who was considered the godfather of critical race theory, along with Kimberly Crenshaw. Derek Bell his experience was actually theorizing why he, as a young civil rights lawyer in Mississippi and elsewhere, why, despite the laws changing in the 1950s and 60s, it was a case around 1970 with the school board in rural county in Mississippi, why all of his work didn't come to anything, or at least not as much as they would have thought. And Bell, at one level, realized that perhaps he and his contemporaries, these lawyers, were a little bit naive about the persistence of racism. And Derek, in fact, he actually quit Harvard, tenured professor, walked away because they had not yet hired a Black woman for a tenure track job at Harvard, and he went on to teach years at New York University Law School. And he began to write not traditional legal academic stuff, but write these books that reflected upon what he had done as a practicing lawyer, what he thought about, but what was the case. And that became, along with another group of white lawyers writing critically about America, this idea of critical race theory. And Bell, in his first book he wrote, the title of it is literally from Jeremiah. And it is these phrases. I'm going to go, if you could go forward just a second here to slide 10. The harvest is past, the rains have come and gone. In Jeremiah it says, we are not saved. Civil rights bills changed laws. My family, when I was 10 years old, could go into a restaurant in Mississippi through the front door, and yet the persistence of racism still existed. Are they getting, because we're getting it here, aren't we? Don't know, maybe, well. What do you think it is?
No one knows.
It might be.
Hold on one second. I'm going to see if I take something off.
Can you hear me? It might be like the rustling.
Pardon?
I don't know if that works or not.
Like,
So a lot of this theory, which graduate students and law students talk about, gets misappropriated, but it's really to see how situations, I think it was here or I was somewhere else, just this week, talked about how their father, who had served in World War II, oh yes, it was a deacon in my diocese.
do you want to just use this for him? Or?
His father fought in World War II and came back and was able to buy a house in California through what we call the GI Bill. And so he probably bought that house for like under $10,000. Today that house would be worth about $400,000. My father and his brother, both World War II veterans, but Black, were not allowed to get that. That is just one example of systemic racism. We could talk about the banking system or the criminal justice system. But that was clearly decided because it wasn't an individual decision. There were individuals involved, yes. Senators and congressmen who said, we want this benefit for our white veterans, but those fellows don't deserve it. As if bullets from Germans and Japanese had a different effect on them. But anyway, that's how systemic racism worked. And this is what Derek Bell and others were trying to decipher. So that is, at some level, the course of our history. Now, the present does require, I think, this self-examination. And it really speaks about what happened as Isaiah says, not only do we remember and stand firm, and you transgressors remember the former things of old, that we examine ourselves. That is the key to the right of reconciliation. The key to that. And when we think about even in the resurrection story, post-resurrection story of the road to Emmaus, those disciples eventually understand that stranger broke down Israel's biblical history. And then they say later, after they break bread, did not our hearts burn? The beginning of their healing was that burning in their hearts, and they understood something. So we need to examine history, acknowledge it, and especially the pain. Recognizing, as Titus said to the mission formation group, there is this balance. Things happened during the colonial period. Willie Jennings talked a lot about how the Portuguese, the Spanish, and then the English, and the French, the Italian, they all encountering these different peoples, essentially categorized them. And they did that, and the bottom caste was Black, the top caste would be white, and these other groups, indigenous, mestizo, others, it was very interesting. They particularly thought in China and Japan that they were like almost white, as my sons would say, white adjacent. In South Africa, in fact, because of the economic relations, the South African government classified Japanese as white, Chinese as Asian, non-white. But, and these are very arbitrary, but that issue of how we classified folks in the beginning, in the colonial period, the discovery period, because this was the first encounter. And as we know, as Jennings points out, religiously, these were often clergy who wrote and took note. There were the exceptional clergy who saw things like slavery and exploitation of the indigenous as wrong, like Barthélemy de las Casas. But most were more interested in what they could do for crown and country as far as economics. And so this difficulty of today, Derek Bell, legally James Cone, this is 12, slide 12, awesome. James Cone, who's the father of Black theology, was really writing to say, yes, we are Christians, and there may be a question about how we've inherited this, but the point for us is that we need to develop as Black people our own sense of understanding of what, and I know from some friends in the UK, it's very, very happening there, was happening in South Africa. How do we contextualize our experience, whether it's a Black Britain? Alan Busek, who's still alive, as a theologian in South Africa. He really took Cone's work, and as a colored Dutch Reformed theologian, he was brilliant in combining John Calvin and James Cone to challenge the prevailing theology of the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa. So all of that work, today what we have is not only this work of challenging, but this backlash to the racial reckoning, because it is painful to look at our history. It is difficult to see our present and how history has impacted us. It's difficult. And so we should not be surprised whether in the church or outside of the church, people want to ignore that and move beyond it. So now I think I'm on slide 13, is that right? There we are. The future. Ezekiel's question is, how then shall we live? And Isaiah says, your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt, and you shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. You shall be called repairers of the breach. I happen to think that folks engaged in mission today, whether domestically or globally, are truly those kinds of repairers of the breach, because what they see, as Paul talked about, they are engaged in the mending of those breaches, of those fractures. And that is the work of building the realm of God, of participating in God's mission. And so when I talk about the hope, it doesn't really come out of that context. It comes out of where we can. That kind of takes me to a principle that I think many of you know, and I'm going to just share this a bit, that go to my concluding stories. How many of you have heard of Lilla Watson, still living in Australia? Not, you may have heard of this quote. She's famous for it. At least Tina and I, when we went to prepare the Jane Butterfield Pressler, I think that's when we first heard it, or some context. Willa Watson, who is an indigenous Australian of Murray, she said, if you have come here, meaning in the community she was, which is poor and disenfranchised, displaced, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Now, I said Little Watson, and if you go to Wikipedia, it's pointed out, she said that phrase was actually a collaborative effort of many original women. Lula is a professor, she's still living in Australia. But I think while as Titus was saying, we may say some missionaries in history made mistakes. I know even like Willie Jennings in his book, one chapter talks about Bishop John Colenso, who served in Natal in South Africa. And Colenso's fight with the Bishop of Cape Town is the reason there's a Lambeth conference every 10 years. I don't have to get into all of that, but Colenso, who came there from England to South Africa and became bishop young age, was brilliant with languages. And Natal is Durban, Pietermaritzburg. This is the height of the Zulu kingdom. He learned Zulu and other languages, and he could translate scripture, and he saw that there was intelligence in the Zulus. Of course, the Zulus will let you know that. But that when today you can talk to one and they would say, the Anglicans, Colenso. And Colenso respected that, and he trained catechists and even clergy. His best white friend was the superintendent, basically the governmental business entity representing the British Crown. And they eventually had a clash, which of course Colenso lost, because the British Empire had a different agenda. And that was one example of where the church, in Colenso's case, was partly co-opted, but partly just sidelined. And so you could pray for these Zulus or whatever, you could have them go to churches, but we will have the power and control over the resources. So, yet today, Colenso's witness, 150 plus years later, is a sign, and the point is, as Desmond Tutu say, he was an example of a white who black folk could look at and say, while he was not perfect, he respected their dignity. And that gets me to this context as I'm going, and I got about 15 minutes later, so I know I'll finish within my hour. About, well, why did you go to South Africa, Walter? And what did you pick up out of that? That's so many things. But because, and this gets to my conversion story, I mean, I grew up in the church, an African-American sect, and then I got enthralled with Catholicism, particularly these Jesuits who, I had high school teachers who not only had advanced degrees, but they had marched with Dr. King, they had marched against the Vietnam War, and although there were only a handful of black students, they really cared about us. I was sitting in a high school class, and some of my black colleagues were complaining. I remember one guy said, yeah, America, you guys say love it or leave it. Well, we black folks, we really want to leave it. And the history teacher said, why don't you stay and make it better? Then he looked at me, I expect you to do something for your people. And so and the fact that Catholic masses were really quick at school. I left the African American Methodist sect in high school, college, and I was a Roman Catholic for about a dozen years. That journey almost led me to become a Jesuit. But it was when I was in the Marine Corps and I was discerning that, I was living in Japan, and again, that idea of mission, that encounter, being the first time as a Christian in a non-Christian context, really solidified my conversion. And then when I came back to the United States and was living in California, when I heard about this Bishop Tutu, and I didn't even know what an Anglican was, then I learned. And I thought maybe, well, I can't be a priest, I'm getting married, but I will maybe a diplomat or a lawyer, and I went and got a master's degree in international relations, and I did my thesis in those early 80s on the role of religion in apartheid South Africa. I studied a famous Catholic Archbishop, Dennis Hurley, studied a famous, courageous, dissenting Dutch Reform theologian, Beers Naudé, and I studied Desmond Tutu. Those three were my study of how they challenged South African civil religion. And that began a several-year journey, things also happening in the Roman communion, that by the end of the 1980s, I was an Episcopalian, but I've always held on to that word Anglican because we are a global church and God forbid I ever become a member of the American sect. So at that point, my wife and I always thought it'd be great to live in another country, and if we have kids, to give them that chance to experience something, would be that word, citizens of the world. This term, we didn't have it then, they called third culture kids, so we had that chance. The meeting that Titus talked about when we met in the 90s, he talked about Zimbabwe. And a few years later, I was in seminary, General Seminary in Jane. Butterfield Pressler met me then, and that gave me an opportunity. In seminary, my first visit, I was talking to Ethan Cole, who served in South Africa as a YAS volunteer, but 1999 was my first visit there. And when I got there, because of some issues with my wife's health and my oldest son's health, there were certain places we knew we couldn't go. We needed to be somewhere urban with good medical situation. And when I got to Cape Town, and I hate to say it, but one day we did not eat traditional local food. We went to a McDonald's near the University of Cape Town. And I said, well, there's a McDonald's here, so my kids won't complain too much if they come here to live. And after graduation in 2000, ordination in 2000, serving in a parish in Shaker, Ohio, we were able to be appointed missionaries. And after a visit in March of 2003, which if you remember what was happening globally, getting ready for the war in Iraq, we visited and we were offered a position at the cathedral, and so we moved. And it was life-changing for all of us as a family. Not only, as Titus mentioned, the contact we had with Desmond Tutu and Malia and his daughters and others. My boss, the dean of the cathedral, the late Rowan Quentin Smith, was an amazing man. At one time, he was chaplain to Father Desmond. So many things I learned from that, took from it. One of the things I learned is that there are whites who were born and raised in South Africa who lived in Texas. We actually have one who lives in Vermont, but the ones I know in Texas, they left because they didn't want to stay under black rule, or they went to Australia or somewhere else. But the whites who stayed to commit to the new South Africa really impressed me. My first visit was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was having hearings. When we moved in 2003, they were still wrapping up final reports and recommendations. And what I just remember is the stories of those black and white who fought in the struggle, however they did that, whether it was armed or non-violently. The Black Slash, a women's group, for example, the things they experienced, and they taught me things. Yes, so many people, even white people, had lost a child. And so many people had at least recognized their history. They could talk about it in a way that I had not seen most white Americans talk about our history. That really impressed me. The other thing that impressed me was in the new South Africa, with many problems South Africa has, the prior president was one who exacerbated a lot of those issues. The current president is trying to struggle to right the ship in certain ways. But what impressed me in the new South Africa was this willingness to embrace change, not be afraid of it. And of all the stories, the one I want to share And then I have one final story, which is actually about my went to God. But South Africa said, our languages, we have 11 official languages. Yes, English and Afrikaans. My sons have no Afrikaans, and because we're in
Yeah,
the Western Cape, this is also.
I'll put it and then Nelson's gonna do it.
And my younger Martin doesn't complain about it, too dumb to learn all this stuff, but, so students that you're gonna be a South African citizen, you need to know at least 2, if not 3 languages. And at the cathedral, the cathedral is very diverse, white, colored, Xhosa, other races, really beautiful realm of God picture. And of course, as Canon pastor, I got to know a lot of them. And one young woman, at that time, she was like my older son's age, so she was probably 12, 13. Jazara, she liked to be called Jazz. She was this beautiful blonde young lady with blue eyes, lovely blonde hair. She's nice, polite, and she would act polite. And we developed the girls' choir, she would sing. She was just wonderful. She attended the Anglican school, St. Cyprian School for Girls. And I remember my colleague who was the chaplain, she was the chaplain at St. Cyprian School, Vivian Harbour, priest. Vivian, I think, still lives in New Zealand with her daughter. But Vivian had just retired from the school. And a couple of weeks later, I wrote her an email because of what happened in church on that Sunday. Jazz was asked to read the lesson that day. And Jazz, I know her family background would have been English, British, not Afrikaans. But Jazz gets up there to read, and we had started doing these texts, the lessons in other languages instead of just English. And all of a sudden, this incredible Xhosa, she is speaking it amazing. Now, I'm not an expert, but the old auntie said she was really good. So to see the, the picture at the lectern of this 12, 13-year-old beautiful white girl was speaking the tongue of the people of the Cape. And I write to Vivian, this is the hope, isn't it, for the nation? Because while we know missionaries learned languages of people for evangelism reasons and so on, and it may have been utilitarian. In this case, in South Africa, it was your language and your culture have value, and you each must respect. So the idea is, Desmond Tutu was the one that got the credit for this term Ubuntu. I am because we are. To me, that particular story was this beautiful example. But the theme of this conference, as I come to my final story in this context, is about healing. And one of the things that a lot of times we don't know that we need healing. Father Paul, sometimes we don't know where we're broken. It was actually, for me, I was in my 30s as a lawyer, thought I knew everything and had stuff going on correctly. And I'm a relatively new Episcopalian. And I go to a training at Trinity Cathedral, and I have one of those memories that you repress as a child. It comes to me. It's because it's about race. It was like the first time, it was kind of like the questions I proposed for the table about noticing race. And it was actually about a visit to Mississippi as a 10-year-old. My father in a very nice car, my brother would have been 8, my mother in the front seat, passenger side. My father was, I'll just say, not treated very kindly. He was called a boy. My father would have been in his 40s, almost 50. He was in his mid-40s. And my brother and I heard it, and I even then knew not to say anything. And I had totally forgotten that until that one day at church on a Saturday morning. And a woman who later became one of my presenters at my ordination, she's gone on to glory, but the Union of Black Episcopalians chapter Cleveland, Ohio, was named the Wilma Ruth Holmes chapter, named after her. She took my hand and said, "Your father did nothing because he needed to save and protect his family." And when sometimes people might say to me, "Walter, you like talking about slavery and Jim Crow?" That's like so long ago. And when I was in Old Testament class, I learned this from Father Dick Corney, who's our Old Testament professor. The generations are not that far apart. An old woman who held my father when he was an infant had been enslaved. His grandparents enslaved my father and mother held my sons. If, in fact, people could touch you and have that experience, that's when they talk about generational, whatever it is, trauma, generational joy, generational wealth. The fact that I could see my father holding his first and second grandchildren, that he, at that same age, had been held by someone who had been enslaved. That was some wound that I, sitting in the middle of, not even aware of it. So in 1999, as I said, that visit to South Africa, I was at the McDonald's from the University of Cape Town. But that visit also took us to Ghana. We spent a week mostly on the coast, Accra. We went down to the Cape Coast Castle. Some of you have probably been there. You get to see the horrors of that. It was deeply, deeply troubling. And in that group, mostly from the Boston Theological Institute, my friend and classmate from seminary, we were the only two from general with that group. We drove back from the coast back to, we were staying at a school in Accra, and we go in dead silence. There were 4 African Americans, and we did not say a word. We happened to be sitting together. The next morning, one of the 4 was actually a professor, the other 3 of us were seminarians. The professor had written a poem overnight to process what he had experienced. And he read that poem at a Presbyterian seminary that we had visited. We were visiting that Presbyterian school that particular morning. And there was I'm sure there was a British or Scots faculty or dean, but the students were Black. They were Ghanaian. And we were all in a group, about 30 of us, so it was like 24 Americans, 6 or 7 Ghana and the British. And when Fred read the poem, at the end of it, there was like this deep silence. And I learned a bit about what happened with the slave trade, who got picked, sold to go and who didn't. And what Ghana has done is they've acknowledged their role. Europe shares the burden of it, but as they said, we lost something by letting our own people go. It hurt us in many ways. So they acknowledged that. That morning, a young Ghanaian seminarian, who happened to be someone who had converted from Islam to Christianity, that's a whole other story. He wants to respond to Fred's poem, a professor at SMU, Methodist Seminary, SMU. And he said, "I may not have this authority, but as a Black African, as a Ghanaian, going back to the generations, I apologize to my brothers and sisters. If China sneezes, we will get pneumonia just like some other country. But we have this religious perception, this amnesia. And so we need to, that amnesis, we need to remember that we are all, as Dr. King would say, inextricably linked in a mutual relationship of mutuality and dependence. And as a presiding bishop, if you don't learn not only language of love, but learn to be in relationship. As William Jennings says, the problem that happened with colonialism was not only displacement, and then with translating the loss of language and then some point of reclaiming language. But finally, because real intimacy, real often blunted, we have inherited this situation in society. And we have to reclaim that sense of communion and intimacy as human beings, whatever our differences. I think I've hit 1 hour and 3 minutes. Thank you for your patience, your indulgence.